Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Yevamos Daf Nun Aleph Yevamos 51, and we're going to start the Daf Yomi on the very last two words of Mem Tes of Nun Amid. Amar Rava, now on top of 51a. Rava asks the following. Rava says, "My time of Rabbi Gamliel." Rava says, "What's the reasoning why Rabbi Gamliel says?" We've been discussing this the last couple of days. Rabbi Gamliel says, "Ein get achar get and ein maimer achar maimer." So, in short, what does this mean? We'll say ein get achar get, that if there's two women who fall to Yibum with one man, and he gives the Yavam gives the Yevama get. And then he gives the second Yevama get. So Rabbi Gamliel says, even though once you give a woman a get, this divorce, you're not allowed to marry her relatives. So he says that the second woman, you can marry her relatives. The second get you give is not potent. So the Gemara wants to know, and also same thing with Maimer, that the second Maimer you do, Maimer is a quasi-betrothal, that the first mimer is effective, but the second mimer is not going to be effective to prohibit her relatives upon the Yavam. So my time of the Rabbi Gamliel. So what's the basis for Rabbi Gamliel's position? So Rava says the Mesafka I get idachi ilodachi, because Rabbi Gamliel was uncertain whether or not the get in a situation of Yibum, because what's required to terminate a Zika Yibum connection? A chalitza. In this case, the person did a get instead of chalitza. So Gamliel says, "Misafka I get idachi lo dachi." We're not sure how much of the relationship the get is going to sever. Ikani ilokani. We're not sure how much of it the maimar is going to strengthen the relationship or not. And so Rabbi Gamliel fleshes it out. Get idachi ilodachi. So the get, we're not sure if it severs the relationship or not, and we say as follows: if the first get that you give is enough to sever it, then basar ma'ikav, then there's no longer a zika, and so therefore the second relationship, what's it doing? Basar ma'ikav, the second one's doing nothing. The first one has severed the whole zika, and if the first one is not strong enough, then and doesn't do anything to sever the relationship, then the second get does nothing. So it's basically, if the first get is strong, then there's nothing left, and if the first get does nothing, then the second get also does nothing. And so too with Maimer, ikani ilokani. He's not sure if the Maimer strengthens the relationship or not. Ikama kani. If the first Maimer that you do with the first woman is effective, then basar ma'ikav, then you've already strengthened the Zika, and there's nothing left for the second one to do. Become a lokani, and if the first one does not do anything, basar nami lokani. Well, then the second one also doesn't do anything. That's how Rabbi explains it. He says that Rabbi Gamliel says we're not sure if the first one does anything, and so therefore the second one for sure is not going to do anything, because if the first one did something, there's nothing left for the second one. If the first one didn't do anything, then the second one's not going to do anything. But Abaye challenges this. Abaye says, we have a brisa that says, even though Rabbi Gamliel says there's no get after get, Rabbi Gamliel is moda. He does admit that there is get after a maimer, and there's a maimer after a get. Meaning to say, if you started with a get and then did a maimer on the second yavama, or the opposite, maimer and then get, Rabbi Gamliel would say that the second act is effective. And thirdly, he says there is a get achar bio maimer, that if there were three yavamos who fell to one yavam, and then he does get and then bia, then he has the marital, the intercourse, and then he does the maimer or get, meaning to say that he adds to the second woman, he does bia, then, or maimer achar bia beget, or if he starts off with get and then he does bia and then he does maimer, then also he says that under those circumstances, that is a valid get, or it is a valid maimer. And this is where Abaye is going to challenge Rava. Because he says, if the whole reason for Rabbi Gamliel why he says that there's no get after get, there's no mimer after mimer, is because we're not sure if it's effective or not. Well, then in this case, then to have a kabiyah d'ilchatchila, then in a situation where you start off with a get and then you did biyah, then that should be completely effective. Because what's the logic? If we're not sure if get works, if the get works, then the get works, and then there's no get after get. But if it doesn't work, then the bia that happens at that point is entirely powerful, and then there's nothing left. So in any way, in a case where there's bia after a get, then following that there should certainly be mimer, or then it should certainly say under those circumstances there's no get or there's no mimer after that. So for that reason, and he says that biyah should be looked at as its initial relationship. If the get was not effective, then that biyah is completely effective, and then there should be nothing after it, no get or mimer. So therefore, Abai gives a different explanation for why Rabbi Gamliel says and get achar get and a mimer achar mimer. He says pshito el Rabbi Gamliel beget dachu mamer dekani. He says Rabbi Gamliel was certain that the get completely severs the zika, and the mimer completely severs and completely strengthens the zika bond. So if that's the case, how do we understand Rabbi Gamliel's position? He says Amar Rabbanan hayavama b'chad tzad mahani baget b'chad tzad mahani b'mimer. But he says, but the Rabbanan, according to Rabbi Gamliel, he says that the Rabbanan instituted that there's an aspect to a woman of a zika of a get, and there's an aspect of a mimer, one severs the relationship and one strengthens it. But that both of those aspects, as long as they have a little bit of those aspects in her, even though you sever the zika, she still has the through the get. She still has the mimer aspect to the zika that can be addressed. And so that's what he says. He says, well, Pshito Rabbi Gamliel was obvious. Rabbi Gamliel beget by a get the dachi mimer dekani, that the get severs the relationship and the mimer strengthens it. Mio Amar Rabbanan, but the rabbis instituted hayavama b'chad tzad mahani baget b'chad tzad mahani b'mimer. The rabbis said that there's one aspect to her, to the zika, to the relationship she has with the yavam, where the get can affect. And there's one aspect where the mimer can affect. Get achar get lo dachi. And if you're going after you gave a get to one woman to give it to the second yevama, it's not going to do anything. Because we already pushed off that aspect of the zika when you gave the first woman the get. And also mimer achar mimer lo kani. Also mimer after mimer is not going to be effective. Because the first person already acquired that aspect of the zika. But get achar mimer, mimer achar get. But if you do a get after a mimer, or the opposite, hay milsa kadachi, hay milsa kakani, then one aspect had severed it and the other aspect still remained to acquire it. So that's Rabbi Gamliel's situation according to Abai. Rabbanan, whereas the Rabbanan say kol chad v'chad takinu Rabbanan. Everything on each person, the rabbis instituted that there would be both of these things. Get to mimer b'yavama. So the rabbis instituted in each person that there would be a get and mimer in the yavama. And so that's why the Rabbanan say that there is get after mimer, or get after get, and mimer after mimer, because the rabbis said, according to Abaye, that the Rabbanan say that as long as you have any aspect of it, it's going to be effective on the other person. And the Gemara says, now back according to Rabbi Gamliel, mimer v'hai bia psula idifa mi mimer agria mi mimer. This aspect which we've been discussing, which is called a bia psula. What's a bia psula? Where the bia is not going to be effective because you already did some aspect with a different one of the yevamas to thereby make it seem like it's possible that the yibum happened with her. So then when you do the bia with the second woman, it's not going to be effective. So because it's possible that the first action you did was effective, and so therefore the zika is terminated. So the Gemara says this bia psua, and to a certain degree, is a difami mimer, and a certain degree is stronger than mimer, and also ugriyam mimer. To a certain degree, it's weaker than this mimer. A difami mimer, it's stronger than the mimer. Diu mimer achar mimer lo mahani. Because let's say, according to Rabbi Gamliel, you do mimer, and then you do another mimer. The second mimer doesn't matter. However, bia achar mimer mahani. But if you did mimer and then you did bia, that bia would be effective to say that you're prohibited to be with her relatives. Ugriya mi mimer, where also bia is worse than mimer, or weaker than mimer. Diu mimer achar get. Let's say you give mimer after the get, according to Rabbi Gamliel, that we're going to say kani l'kula shiur to get. Then there's nothing left, and so therefore, if you do a mimer after that mimer, it's nothing. So if once you do one mimer after a get, all the zika has been filled up. V'yu bia after a get, but if you do bia after the get, lo kanya l'kula shiur get, you could still do mimer, and so therefore the whole entire get has not been filled up. Okay, so now the rabbis say, let's analyze what Rabbi Gamliel is saying. Tan Rabbanan Keitzad Amar Rabbi Gamliel and get achar get. How does Rabbi Gamliel say that there's no get after a get? So let's say you have shtei Yevamos. You have two co-wives. Shenafu fnei yavam echad. You have co-wives that fell before one yavam. Minasan get lazu v'get lazu. And the yavam gives the first one a get, and then he gives the second one a get. So Rabbi Gamliel says it's not, the second one is nothing. Either for Abaye because he says, because we weren't sure if it was effective, or according to Abaye, because you filled up the entire aspect of the get, the entire zika of the get. So under this circumstance, where you give a get to one and get to the other, Rabbi Gamliel says, do chalitza with the first woman, because that's where the get works. So you're already prohibited to her relatives. And you're prohibited to all her relatives. But whereas with the second woman, you're going to be allowed to be with her relatives because the second get was nothing, and so you haven't divorced her, and so therefore you're allowed to be with her relatives. The Chachamim, whereas the Chachamim say, Nasan get lazu, the get lazu, the Chachamim say that if you give a get to this one and a get to that one, asur bekrovos shtein, you're prohibited to be with the relatives of both of them, because the rabbis say there is get after a get. The chalitza la'achas mehen, and do chalitza with whichever one you want. And it's also the same idea, mutatis mutandis, with two yevamim and one yevama. It's the same principles. And Kate said, now we say the next aspect. Kate said, Amar Rabbi Gamliel, a mimer after mimer. How does Rabbi Gamliel say there's no mimer after mimer? How does Rabbi Gamliel say that? So it's the following. Again, let's say you have these two Yevamos who fell in Yibam to one man. But also mimer bazil. And let's say he does mimer with one and then mimer with the other one. Rabbi Gamliel says no sin get lo rishona, but chalitza. Rabbi Gamliel says you give a get to the first woman, and then you do chalitza because the mimer on the second one is nothing. But asur b'krovasa, and then you're prohibited to be with her relatives. Mutter b'krova shnia, and you're allowed to be with the relatives of the second one. Whereas Chachamim say no sin get l'shtein. The Chachamim say under these circumstances you give a get to both of them. The asur b'krova shnein. And you're not allowed to be with the relatives of either one, and so therefore it doesn't matter who you do chalitza with, because they're already, both of the relatives are already prohibited you. Chalitza la'achas man, just do chalitza. And also it's the same principle with maimer achar maimer by two yevamim and one yevama. So now the Gemara says, let's analyze this statement that Amar Mar, we learned Nasan get lazu, if you gave a get to both of them. Rabbi Gamliel says, Chalitza Rishona v'asur krovaseh. Rabbi Gamliel says, do chalitza on the first woman. And why on the first woman? Because you're already prohibited to her relatives, and therefore, mutter b'krovashni. And then if you do it that way, you're going to be allowed to be with the relatives of the second one. So let's say that this is indeed a refutation of Shmuel. Well, what did Shmuel say? Now, Amar Shmuel taught, Chalitz l'balas aget, or niftarot tzara. Shmuel said that if you do chalitza on the woman who got a get, the co-wife is not going to be exempt. and the kohen is going to require a chalitza. What's the scenario we're talking about here, where two women fall to yibum with you? You gave a get to the first one, and then you realize the get is not sufficient, so you want to give her chalitza. So Shmuel is in the position that giving that woman chalitza is not going to release the second woman's zika. Why? The second Yevama zika, because the chalitza that you're giving her is not a strong chalitza. Because why is it not a strong chalitza? Because you already gave her a get. So the chalitza you're giving her is weaker because the get diminishes her zika. So therefore, in that case, Shmuel says that you have to give the get to the chalitza to the second woman. So isn't this Rabbi Gamliel's statement when he says that if you give a get to the first one, then you have to do chalitza with the first one? Why? It's the reputation of Shmuel says you'd have to give chalitza to the second one. Amar Shmuel would say, no, not necessarily. It's not a refutation of me. When I say my position that that it's not enough to do the chalitza with the one who got the get, I said it. I said according to the position, it says that there's a very strong zika between the Yevama and the Yavam. Rabbi Gamliel Savar ain't zika. Rabbi Gamliel says there's no zika. Since there's a very strong zika, under those circumstances, that's why you need a strong chalitza to get rid of it. But Rabbi Gamliel says there's no zika, and therefore any chalitza could get rid of the zika that's remaining. When we do Rabbi Gamliel Savar ain't zika, from the fact that Rabbi Gamliel says there's no zika, the Gemara says, let's therefore suggest, we're on the top of 51b, let's therefore suggest Rabbanan Savar Yesh Zika. Let's therefore suggest that the rabbis say that there is a Zika. And so therefore, the Katani safe, if that's the case, you have a question from the concluding clause, because it says, so too you would say the same thing by two Yevamin and one Yevama. Lema, let's just say then, if according to the Rabbanan that there is a Zika, maybe this then is a statement, a refutation of Rav Barafuna, the Amarav Barafuna Amarav, Chalitza Pesua, that if you have a Chalitza that is Pesua, meaning to say a Chalitza that's not as strong, that it follows a get, that Yitzricha Lachzor Koa'achin, that you're going to need to give the Chalitza on all the brothers. And so therefore, since you're going to need to do the chalitza on all the brothers, because it's a chalitza psua, but in this case where you gave a get after a get, the Rabbanim don't say you need to do a chalitza on all the brothers. They just said that just one of them requires a chalitza. So even where one chalitza is sufficient for her, but we see that there's a reputation of Rav Barafuna in the name of Rav. So the Gemara says, it says, no, actually they both say there's no Zika. And that's why you don't need to do Chalitza from all the brothers. But that's exactly what we're arguing about. Don't say that this is an argument about Yesh Zika or Ein Zika. So the Gemara says, Amar Mar, let's analyze the statement. Also, Maimer Bazu. That's either Maimer with this one or Maimer with that one. Rabbi Gamliel says, no, Singetla Rishona v'chol itzla. Asher Bekrova said that if you do Maimer to this one and then you do Maimer to the second one, Rabbi Gamliel says you have to give a get to the first one and you do Chalitza with her, and then you're not allowed to be with your relatives. Umutar Bekrova Shnia, but you can be with the relatives of the second one. So the Gemara says, well, if Rabbi Gamliel says that the second Maimer is completely ineffective, well, if that's the case, why doesn't he do Yibam with the first one? He can do Yibam. Why does he have to do Chalitza with her? The second Maimer was nothing, so he really only has an action of the strengthening of Zika with the first woman. Why can't he do Yibam with her? So the Gemara says, no, technically he can, but since he did Maimer with the second one, if we're going to allow him to do Yibam, we're concerned. We're worried he's going to come and do Yibam with the second one. And that would be a big problem because he already has the Maimer with the first one, so he can no longer do Yibam with the second one for sure. So therefore, we have that concern. So now that we've said that Rabbi Gamliel says, "Ein get achar get or ein Maimer achar Maimer," we've offered two suggestions as to what the basis for his logic is. One basis is that we're saying he's not sure if the get or the Maimer have any effectiveness to it, and so therefore, for sure, it's not going to do anything with the second one. Or else the other possibility is no, it is effective, but it's completely filled up its space, and therefore, if you do it again, it's not going to have any impact. So now in the Gemara, now it comes along Rabbi Yochanan saying this position of Rabbi Gamliel is similar to 4 other positions in Shas. This reminds us of the Gemara in Sukkah, where it says Sukkah diras keva, and we said that there are 6 positions, 6 people who have that position about the effectiveness of the status of living in Sukkah in the first chapter of Masechah Sukkah. So it's similar to this. These positions are not exactly the same, but they're saying that there are similarities, and it's highlighting the similarities. So, what does the Gemara say? Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shammai, Rabbi Shimon ben Azzi, Rabbi Nechemiah, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shammai, Rabbi Shimon ben Azzi, and Rabbi Nechemiah, Kula Sfiru, Maimer Kona, Kinyan Gamar. He says everybody is going to, all of them are on the position that Maimer is Kona Kinyan Gamar. They're all in the position that Maimer is completely effective at strengthening the Zika. They're all of that position. So says the Gemara, let's go through all of that. Rabbi Gamliel, we just said, and this goes according to Abaye, who says that Maimer is Kona. Even according to Rabbi, says Maimer might be Kona, that Maimer might be strengthening. Fine. What about Beis Shammai's position? The Tanan. You have the following scenario. Shlosha Achin. Let's say you have 3 brothers. So let's say you have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, and they are married. Reuven is married to Rachel, and Shimon is married to Leah. They are sisters. So 3 brothers married to 2 sisters, and the 3rd brother is a bachelor. So the 3rd brother is a bachelor. So let's say Reuven died, and now Levi comes, and what does he do? Levi does Maimer with Rachel, and so he has his Maimer with her. And then Shimon dies. Beis Shammai says Levi is already married now to Rachel. Even though he only did Maimer, we view them as though they're married. And therefore Shimon's wife doesn't need anything. She goes free to the market without requiring a chalitza, because the fact that he did Maimer was enough to say that Leah falls to Yibum with someone who's married to her sister, and that doesn't work. She goes free without chalitza. That's proof that according to Beis Shammai, Maimer is effective. Rabbi Shimon, how do we know Rabbi Shimon says Maimer is koned? Tanya, Amaru Rabbi Shimon Chachamim. Rabbi Shimon said to the Chachamim in the following. Okay, what are we talking about here? We're talking about where there's a woman who falls to Yibum to 2 9-year-old brothers. Now, 9 years old is old enough for have technically a bia, sexual relations for a 9-year-old boy is considered a binding act, but they're too young to do yibum. So the rabbis considered that the bia of a 9-year-old is considered to be equivalent to a maimer. So the case is as follows. That we were going to get to this in Perek Isha Rabbah. You have a 9-year-old who was with his Yevama, and then his other 9-year-old brother came and also did bia with this Yevama. So we say, so it's therefore this case is equivalent to like Maimer Achar Maimer. And so the Rabbanan say that under those circumstances that it's like she was betrothed to both, and therefore she's prohibited to both relatives. Whereas the Rabbanan say, whereas Rabbi Shimon says, no, the second one is not. The first one is completely koneh, and therefore the second one does nothing. And that's what Rabbi Shimon says in Chachamim. In Bias Rishon Bia, if the first Bia of the 9-year-old is considered Bia Sheni ain't a Bia, the second one is nothing. And in Bias Sheni, in Bias Rishon ain't a Bia, and if the first Bia is nothing, Bia Sheni Nami ain't a Bia, and then the second one is also nothing. And the Rabbana Vabia Spentesha, and since it was a Bia of a 9-year-old, the Kamaimer Shavi Rabbana. The rabbis say that that's the equivalent of Maimer. The Kamaimer Rabbi Shimon ain't a Bia, and that's not Bia. So we see from here that Maimer is Rabbi Shimon says is Kona, because he says that she's only prohibited to the first one. This is similar to Rabbi Gamliel's, as explained by Rav. Now we have the third approach is Ben Azai, because the time we learned in the Brisa, Ben Azai says, Yesh Maimer Achar Maimer, B'shnei Yevama v'Yevama Achas. Ben Azai says there is Maimer after the Maimer, there's Maimer after the Maimer, with two Yevamin and one Yevama. Meaning to say as follows, that if you have two Yevamin and two brothers, and each one does Maimer with the other one, then Ben Azai is going to say that there is, each one of the brothers has the Maimer coming from him, each one has that aspect of it. And so there is Maimer there. But ein Maimer achar Maimer b'shnei Yevamos v'Yevama echad. But there's no Maimer achar Maimer with two Yevamos and one Yavam, because the Maimer is Kona there. And so therefore this is also the proof of Maimer being Kona. And we come to the last opinion, which is the opinion of Rabbi Nechemia, whether it's the bia, or the chalitza. Once you do the bia or the chalitza, then it severs the whole zika, and any action you do afterwards is not going to be effective. But bia psula, the k'maimer shavi rabbana. But we know that the bia here, and he says the bia, even if it happens in the middle, even if it's not at the beginning, it's equivalent of maimer, and the rabbis say ein acharei klum, according to Ben Azai. So we see from here that maimer is also kona. Okay, so I'll see if anybody has any questions about this. Yeah.